Hello and welcome to this online panel discussion on the release of the report. No internet means no work, no pay, no food. Internet shutdowns deny access to basic rights in digital India. This is a joint report by Human Rights Watch and the Internet Freedom Foundation. So while the Indian government has been pushing and initiatives that serve, among others, the most
This meeting is being
marginalized,
recorded.
communities and persons in India. India also tops intentional internet shutdowns year after year in the world. So we have for today as panelists Vineet Bambu, a member of the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, or the Organization for the Empowerment of Workers and Peasants. This is a grassroots workers and peasants movement in India. Tim Engelhardt, Human Rights Officer, Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development Division, Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. He's the author of the 2022 report, Internet Shutdowns, Trends, Causes, Legal Implications and Impacts on a Range of Human Rights, which was published by the UN Human Rights Office. Apar Gupta, who's founding director, Internet Freedom Foundation, which among other things undertakes litigation on the topic of intentional internet shutdowns in India, and Jayashree Bajoria, Associate Director Asia at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to all participants and panelists. So starting with Jayashree, could you please begin by telling us about the main findings and recommendations of the report?
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you, everyone who's joined online. Thank you so much for taking time out on a busy afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. As Rohini said, I am the author of this joint report that Human Rights Watch and Internet Freedom Foundation together published today. The report looks at the impact of internet shutdowns in India and what India shuts down the internet more than any other country in the world since 20. And it is doing so even as the Indian government is pushing for Digital India, a mission that actually seeks to digitize the delivery of all public services in the country, which also means that when the internet is shut down, it actually disproportionately harms vulnerable communities, people living in poverty, who are dependent on crucial social protection measures of the government, on government programs. So including right to food, right to livelihoods. And this is what the report really found, that the disproportionate harm, especially on economic social rights of vulnerable communities in rural areas. HRW and IFF did this research. We started last year in July. We interviewed over 70 people across the country, over 50 people who were directly affected by internet shutdowns in many parts of the country, including Jammu and Kashmir, Manipur, Meghalaya, Assam, Rajasthan, Haryana, found how it is actually. For instance, now, under the government's Right to Food program, ration shops require internet access to authenticate the biometric details of every customer who comes there to get the food grains, subsidized food grains or free food grains that they are entitled to by the government. But for that, they need this machine that uses a mobile SIM that can authenticate their fingerprints that are linked to their Aadhaar biometric card. Similarly, in rural areas, there is a huge paucity of jobs. There are not enough jobs, so the government has this income security, livelihood security program called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, NREGA. And again, there is this attempt to digitize the entire program online. So from creating muster rolls to marking attendance online at job sites where digital connectivity is actually already a problem in most remote areas. But now internet shutdowns means that the work completely comes to a stop, and then payment of wages. All of it is linked to access to internet. What we also found that these internet shutdown decisions are being made in a wholly erratic and unlawful, not necessary, disproportionate manner that these blanket shutdowns are happening. So there was a Supreme Court judgment in January 2020, Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India, something that IFF was also involved in litigation. And in that, the Supreme Court actually put down certain safeguards, procedural safeguards, to ensure there is some accountability for these shutdowns, because they found that the shutdowns are quite drastic and they should be avoided at all costs if possible. So Internet Freedom Foundation filed right to information applications to all 28 states in the country to look at if there was actual compliance with these directives. And in fact, what we found in the report when we look at that over 50%, so we actually identified 127 shutdowns between January 2020 to December 2022 over a period of 3 years. And what we find in those 127 shutdowns is over 50% of them are either to prevent or in response to protests or to prevent cheating on examinations. Now, these clearly are wholly disproportionate and unnecessary. So the idea of this report is to showcase to what kind of harms they are causing to actual lives of people, because often in the numbers, the real stories of human beings are lost. And that is the effort to bring in the public domain how it affects and disrupts people's livelihoods, causes irreversible harm. India is a booming gig economy. Gig workers are completely dependent for their livelihoods on this. So that is the attempt with this report. And there are recommendations in the report for the Indian government, for state authorities at all levels, to ensure that these shutdowns one is that these shutdowns should end, and if at all they must be imposed, they must comply with international legal standards, with Anuradha Bhasin judgment, and should be lawful, proportionate, necessary, limited in scope and in territory, and really a measure of absolute last resort. Thank you so
much. Thanks a lot, Jayashree. The next question is to Vineet. The Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan works closely with workers employed under the NREGA, and it works largely on social justice issues and with rural communities. With an increase in digital connectivity in India, what, according to you, is the level of dependence that people in rural India have on having access to the internet, and what effect do intentional internet shutdowns have on their lives and livelihoods in general?
Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank all visible, invisible faces that are involved in bringing out this report, because you are bringing out some voices who are kind of never heard of. The numbers are huge, though even if numbers are small, the voice should be heard. So I will start with what Jayashree mentioned about the employment guarantee program. It's one of the world's largest employment guarantee program, and about 144 million workers across India are working on this particular program. And particularly for state of Rajasthan, which is after Kashmir, it's been the highest number of times that they have used the internet shutdown. There are 13.7 million workers in rural areas who work on some of the remotest locations. And this program provides 100 days of guaranteed employment. Now, most of the process involved as the report also mentions, most of the things are done through online systems, starting from generation of job card, which is needed to get the employment, to demanding work, actually allocating work, and then generating the attendance registers, which are called muster rolls. Everything is digitized. And even on when the workers complete their work, they are supposed to get the payment. The whole payment process, that is also digitized. So in case there is a disruption in any of these internet connectivities, then this program gets affected. Recently, the government has also introduced a system of online attendance. So they have introduced a mobile monitoring app, which every supervisor of the work is supposed to have a particular standard of Android phone with a particular version. And they are supposed to mark attendance. Earlier, it used to be on paper. Now everything is on the app. And if anything gets missed out on the app, then you are gone. Even though you are there, you have worked at the work site, there's no way you will be paid in case the attendance is not registered there. There have been some exceptions wherein they have allowed at the district level that in case there's a problem, you can reach out to district level. But given the geographical spread of Rajasthan, it's one of the largest states in India, and people are barely able to reach out. They don't know all these provisions. And then there are also verbal orders. There's shutdown or something is not working. There are provisions, but there might be the verbal orders side by side saying, if your app is not working, just let even if workers are on the work site, let them go home. Don't register their work on that day. So those are kind of things which are go offline. They are not part of the system, but they informally, all these things happen. So if that's a big problem. Anyway, there's a big digital divide, but on top of that, if there's any such shutdown, it definitely affect well aware of their rights. They will just kind of agree to what others are saying. So most of them might not insist on saying that if we are at the work site, we are doing work, our attendance should be recorded. They will rather go with what others are saying. So that's one huge number that gets affected. Then you also talked about the subsidized food program, public distribution system. So they're also only dependent on either or this subsidized food for their sustenance. So about 10.7 million families, which translates to about 43.8 million people, get affected in the state of Rajasthan, are in this program. Internet shutdown was imposed. They were supposed to get the subsidized food, but they weren't able to because of the shutdown. It's a different issue regarding the speed and all of that. I'm not going to go there. But the food subsidy, if you don't claim it during that month, it gets lapsed. In one particular instance where in my area, the internet was, there was a shutdown because of some communal tensions. In that particular instance, the government did allow people to take their ration next month. So that's kind of a good thing that at least they weren't denied of their entitlement. But I'm not sure how many of these things can be done or registered, or even sometimes these people don't, even if government sends out SMS saying internet shutdown, not many people are able to read these messages, and they will sure know that because there's no internet, we can't do anything, you have to visit again. And there might be multiple visits. So communication is also a problem. Though once some people know, they will let the community know, but it's the initial few people who are might go empty-handed. Then there are about 670 government services which they have given to the people who can get license. It's a commission-based work. So these government services can also be availed by customer service centers. And many of government works are now done through customer service centers. For that, also you need to be using their mobile phones. Even in the smallest governing unit, panchayat offices, we have seen, even though government claims that there's internet connectivity, either the speed will be too low or so many a times people use their own mobile phone connections to connect even at the lowest level government offices. So many people have to visit and then realize that there's no internet, so they cannot avail these government services. The youngsters in these rural areas nowadays are using digital platforms to do transactions for the money transfer. So in such kind of urgencies, they realize they are not able to do these transfers. If we talk about social security pensioners and other people, these transactions, and not generally young people are doing these digital transactions, but you talk about other people, very few of them know about digital transactions. Generally, they will use the banking facilities. Banks used to transact earlier, but now most of them has given it out to banking correspondents who are licensed people who work for bank to provide last mile connectivity. But the problem is banks might have a different system of using internet, but the banking correspondent generally use mostly they use their mobile connections. Few of them might have broadband connections. So it's true for everyone, but it's particularly very difficult for social security pensioners because they haven't, by that time they get their social security pension. So every month or every bi-monthly, they might go to these customer service centers and they ask whether they have got their pensions or not. And it's very painful for these people because of increased transportation cost. They might not be based very close to their homes. So it's very difficult to people who are elderly, who are disabled to get to these places. Then there are many youngsters who try to apply for government jobs or other jobs. So it's always problem in case there's a shutdown to apply for these jobs to get. And even most of these centers are based away from their localities, urban areas. So when they go out to these places, these people are new to these places, and many a times Rajasthan government has done internet shutdown because there is an examination and they don't want people to copy or use social media to provide answers and everything. So they shut down
Vineet,
internet.
we are running a little bit over time.
Okay. So I'll just wind up
Yeah.
2 lines, which maybe Apar might also be talking about. So one learning we have from RTI movement is that we should involve people in the process to find out what the difficulties are rather than shutting them down. And also we should have some sort of education to cater with fake news or the means which are used to spread rumors. So I'll finish with that, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Vineet. We will take questions for the panel in the last 20 minutes or so. So for those of you who have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Apar, the IFF has been involved in litigation on the subject of internet shutdowns in India. Why does the government shut down the internet so frequently, and how do we change that? And are there ways to stop this abusive practice?
Thank you for posing that question to me, Rohini. It's been a pleasure working with HRW on this report, and also MKSS, who have provided a lot of support as people, both Krishnesh Bapat, who led this work for IFF, and Jayashri visited Rajasthan. I'd particularly like to thank people from MKSS who we need the voices of the people who are the most vulnerable and have the least access to the internet are reflected in conversations around issues such as internet shutdowns, where primarily people who are in metropolitan cities like Delhi, Bangalore, Bombay, they get reflected much more often. And it's articulated in forms and manners of speech rights purely as a political conception rather than a much more deeper disentitlement which happens to people's livelihood, support systems of subsidy, entitlements towards gas, which are all legal and constitutional rights, which they are guaranteed by itself. So today, as the Indian state becomes more and more digitized, I believe more of this form of research needs to be conducted in diverse and different parts of India to unearth what is the true situation in how digital India today is experienced by those people who are supposed to be its ultimate beneficiaries, the most vulnerable, the people who are the most poor, who crave the access to the internet for their social mobility, for the economic prosperity, for the opportunities which it is offered. Now, in respect to Jammu and Kashmir, which has been indeed a very deep and painful deprivation, but I've seen in other parts of India as well, it has been, in my conception, very, very, if I would think about it a little much more abstract and removed from this report, it would be that India is on its path to being a democracy and is today a post-colonial state. And I would like to state this by saying that a lot of the legal provisions which enable this form of control by the government over forms of communication are reflected in legal codes, which is contained in the report, which is the Indian Telegraph Act, which is Section 5(2), which says that the union government pretty much can intercept and also control the flow of transmission of messages on what? A telegraph by itself. And there are, of course, certain internet shutdown rules which have been made subsequently in recent years. But I think the Anuradha Bhasin judgment by itself, which was passed by the Supreme Court, requiring transparency of orders and disclosures as to reasons why the internet is shut down, clear articulations of reasons which fit within the categories which are permissible of public safety and public security, reviews which need to be done through constituted review committees by itself are very, very important for researchers in unearthing the reasons behind internet shutdowns. And the reason I'm saying this is that, Rohini, when you ask me what are the reasons behind internet shutdowns, I cannot say with confidence because all state governments, as per RTIs which were filed, and are a part of this report, are not complying with the Anuradha Bhasin judgment in proactive transparency, in publishing their orders on specific periods, in which sometimes information which is queried from local populations and inhabitants contradicts the website updates with respect to the internet shutdown orders, where some are just missing by itself. Now, even with the limited transparency which we have, I would like to go back to why I said that we are in a process from turning from a, hopefully, process from turning from a post-colonial state to a constitutional democracy, because the administrative culture beyond the legal rules by itself is exercised for categories beyond public safety and security. So just taking one data point, out of the 127 shutdowns across India and excluding Jammu and Kashmir, shockingly, 37 of these shutdowns were implemented to prevent cheating in school or government job examinations, hardly constituting a public emergency or threat to public safety by itself. The rest of the 90 shutdowns were imposed to prevent or respond to public protests, communal violence, or other law and order concerns. Quite often, these were preventive, rather than an internet shutdown being made in order to prevent misinformation or actual threats to violence. Distinction is important, is that the union government does not catalog internet shutdowns, does not query this data, does not provide transparency, and this is foundational to a larger absence of not only transparency, but but study and analysis both from a humanitarian and economic perspective as to the injuries and costs which are suffered by millions of Indians, including people in Rajasthan. So I hope that answers some part of the question, and I look forward to the interaction in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Apar. Moving to Tim, is the internet, is the right about your observations globally, and why is it important to address them?
Sorry, I'm very sorry, you cut out on my side at least. Could you just repeat quickly?
Is the right to internet a fundamental human right? And could you tell us a little about your observations about internet shutdowns globally, and why is it important to address them?
Thank you. Now it was loud and clear. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everyone joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Yeah, first I want to make one correction. I was called the author of this report. You know, they say that it takes a village to raise a child, and it's quite similar with these kind of reports. So I don't want to take the credit for the work of many of my colleagues. But yes, I've been working on this topic for a while, and it's very close to my heart. And more broadly, it's internet shutdowns have been a long-standing issue for our office, but also for various other UN human rights mechanisms. The Human Rights Council has condemned internet shutdowns repeatedly over the years. The Human Rights Committee has issued a general comment on freedom of assembly and condemned in that context internet shutdowns. And the special rapporteurs are on the record many times being very critical of internet shutdowns. And also the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has called upon states to refrain from shutting down the internet. So I thought that was good for general framing. Now to your question, is internet as a human right? You don't find the word internet in the human rights treaties, right? As much as you don't find references to specific technologies in general in there. But that doesn't mean that human rights don't matter for the question if there's access or not. It's quite the contrary. It's very clear these days, and you, in all your interventions, already made it very clear how important it is to have access to the internet, to exercise all kinds of rights, basically the entire range of human rights we can think of. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, right to health, right to education, right to social security, etc., etc. You already gave us extremely strong examples how these things play out. So, and that means that this has consequences for what states can do with regard to the internet. There's one, the duty to respect various human rights. So the government must not interfere with these rights unless there's a justification, certain conditions are met. But there's also a positive obligation of states to promote and facilitate human rights. And it means governments have to promote and facilitate access to the internet. So they should take all necessary steps that to ensure that people have meaningful access to the internet. Shutdowns are an inherent tension with that. And our finding is that shutdowns almost inevitably fail to meet the fundamental requirements of legality. Well, that can be possible, but often laws that are applied are far too broad and vague, and fail to be necessary or proportionate to achieve a legitimate goal. One word of clarification: we understand shutdowns as quite broad. We're not only talking about the shutdown of any connectivity at all, but also the interference with the use and the accessibility of communications platforms such as social media. That's important to note because sometimes there are misunderstandings, and we think the same considerations apply in these contexts too. You have already pointed out to various contexts that in which internet shutdowns take place, and we came to similar conclusions on a more global scale. And what's important to usual ones, we should get worried, at least then. They tend to occur in particular contexts. Some have been already mentioned: protests and political crisis between 2016 and 2021. Of those we are aware of, almost half of the global shutdowns took place in these contexts. 225 shutdowns were recorded during public demonstrations. During the same period, 52 elections were in some way affected by internet shutdowns. So we really speak here about core democratic rights that are implicated. Shutdowns in the context of armed conflict and armed operations are quite common, making it even harder for the populations that are affected to be connected to the world, to find help, to find information. School exams, indeed, are globally, or in many of the countries that impose shutdowns, a common practice, and I agree it's simply not justifiable. So the problem with shutdowns, we've already talked about that problem. I pointed to it in some way. The impacts are broad and indiscriminate, which means it's inevitable that they affect thousands or millions of people and their rights and their totally legitimate ways of using the internet, and they're necessary and that are necessary for many of their for gaining a livelihood, for going to school, etc. And we found many examples where healthcare was affected, either because supply chains were disrupted, where doctors or patients couldn't find crucial information. In the COVID-19 context, for example, that played out quite dramatically. Internet shutdowns restrict access to emergency services. We have seen how internet shutdowns made humanitarian work partly impossible, either because funds dried out or because aid workers couldn't access data, information, etc., and aid could simply not reach the people who needed it. The economic impact, there's a growing number, is huge. There's a growing number of studies and tools looking into that. I find the World Bank's finding about the internet shutdown in Myanmar between February and December 2021 quite remarkable, because the World Bank found that it cost the country $2.8 billion, reversing economic progress made over the previous decade. And over a third of the companies surveyed for that report indicated that limiting their internet access had severely constrained their business operations. So in conclusion, shutdowns run directly counter to all efforts to close digital divides. They threaten the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. They must be seen in the context of, often in the context of further restrictions of democratic backsliding in many contexts. And we just call on state, simply don't shut down the internet. They hurt your people, they hurt your economies, and they're almost never justifiable under international human rights law. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tim. In the interest of time, I'll quickly move to the questions. There is a question by Rohan Jacob. Given the shutdowns seem to happen in a few states or regions, could private internets funded by a few significant international and Indian NGOs and under the control of a UN entity, for example, provide a near-term solution for the most affected? That's quite innovative. For example, farmers and job seekers. Which of the panelists would like to answer this?
So India, in addition to the Indian Telegraph Act, also has the Indian Wireless Telegraphs Act. And that essentially is a form of licensing on who can own a radio transistor at an individual level, and it's valid law. And even today, there are exemption notifications, which is why we can purchase a smartphone which has a radio transmitter, and that is illustrative of the amount of regulatory control which exists. And this is important for us to consider, because quite often in these conversations we get a technical solution to what is essentially a problem which is a little deeper. It's structural in that sense, right? It's not only the law, it's also an administrative culture of shutting down the internet and preventing accountability, or just like prevention is better than cure kind of thinking, where you don't regard the injuries caused by the facility being disrupted as being immense. So I'd just like to put that out there, not only because it's impossible, but quite often the workaround is only a workaround. It's not a system scale solution. And I know I'm a lawyer and I'm answering it as a lawyer somewhat, but I do think technical solutions quite often may not be able to also on a very system level match a state-based response if they are only circumvention strategies in itself rather than strategies of reform.
True. So one of the participants, Tusharji, has posted a link which seems to be code for a circumvention strategy, but do we even know whether, and this is not an audience question, this is from me, do we even know whether the technical circumvention measures are legal or are they gray, right? Like if the intent is, if the phrasing of these shutdown orders is, no access, then finding a workaround might as well fall foul of those sort of orders. Anonymous question, can you give examples of the damage that internet shutdowns caused during protests, and what did international world governments do? Okay, there are quite a few questions I see, and I am not sure, but I'll try and take as many as possible during before we end. Tim, what did international governments do, and what was the damage that internet shutdowns caused during protests?
The damage is manifold. Shutdowns already interfere with the possibility to organize, to find allies, to spread information, etc. While they're ongoing, they have been claimed that they are necessary for example, preventing violence or stopping violence. And I can't go through all the examples, but what we have seen is at the same time that there's a counterproductive nature to shutdowns because they create more uncertainty. They prevent people from actually finding safe spots, finding information independently. They become exposed to arbitrary interventions. Another problem can be that shutting down can be used to, and has been used to cover up abuses that are happening. In some regions where we had mass protests for a longer period of time, where many protesters were injured or even killed by authorities, internet shutdowns made it extremely hard for collecting the evidence of that, for news agencies to report on that, made it impossible to do human rights monitoring, which creates a huge accountability gap. On a final note, freedom of assembly can also be exercised entirely online. Like you can have some sort of online assembly and association. Shutting it down takes away that possibility completely. So we have a broad range of impacts, and at the same time, the right to assemble and to protest is so deeply rooted in the idea of democratic governance and human rights that these interferences become additionally serious. Thanks.
A question by Iftikhar Gilani: has there been any study whether these shutdowns really help in restoring public order as the government claims? Public order, public disorder, agitations, etc. have been there for centuries, even before there was no internet. Apart.
Yeah, so I think this is a little removed from the report, but I'll still try to answer it to some extent. See, the issue which we are quite often faced with is that there's limited state capacity, and that's always been the case in India by itself. But if you're looking towards the internet as a technology in a constitutional republic by itself, which is also a part of a program towards system delivery of services, then it's not consistent to shut it down for anticipating law and order issues or violence. There's in fact, a Supreme Court judgment which says that what should be a government response to restriction, and they use a very good metaphor. It's in is Jagjeevan Ram, is that it should be like a spark to a powder keg. It's a very animated way to put it. But essentially, when you're restricting something, there needs to be a basis of evidence to it. And quite often what we are seeing as a pattern in India has been that, and I also remember I was sitting with a district magistrate when they used to exercise powers under Section 144 to shut down the internet. And they said, I can't take the death of a person on my conscience, and it's better to shut down the internet, while disregarding all the other injuries which do take place in terms of loss of livelihood or people going hungry now because the internet is shut down. And also a few years later, I remember that there was a panel discussion at We the India and NDTV, and one person said that in a local communal incident in which there was a riot-like situation, that person essentially hid at a certain specific place and point, and that was for a few hours. And when that person tried to contact their family members and could not do so, to only get in touch with them the next day. Their family members feared for the worst, had gone to hospitals, thought they were dead. That kind of mental trauma they had to go through. What these two experiences show quite often is that there's a huge amount of I think so. There's a huge amount of difference in how the institutionalized mechanism of enforcing an internet shutdown is conceptualized by public officials and how it is actually felt by people who suffer through it. And what I'd like to finally say, and possibly this is my last intervention here, is that the report sets out a very credible set of recommendations. And starting out with them, it's not much. It is to implement the letter of the law as the Supreme Court has pronounced it in Anuradha Bhasin. Close to 3 years now. The least we can ask for is transparency, because that's the stepping stone towards accountability and hopefully social justice.
Question from Alina Kael. Do you know if any of the initiatives of making India more digital are funded or co-funded by other countries or institutions? If yes, how useful would it be to reach out to them to let them know the investment is being directly countered by these shutdowns? That will have to go to Apar also, right?
I can take it. Thank you, Rohini. I can take it. Thank you, Alina, for asking the question. So I don't know of any funding, but I do know that there are lots of efforts. See, India really is seen as a leader in technology in many ways. It is seen as a country that is much invested in digital innovation. And is seen as a leader, especially in the global south, for finding solutions in technology for governance. And when you see that context and you see these internet shutdowns, there is a complete disconnect, right? There is a lot of inconsistency there when you see internet suspensions and when you see this idea of a digital India and digital innovation. So in that perspective, I think that there is space to engage with the Indian government to discuss the kind of harms that are being caused. Also, clearly, there are efforts that are being made to, have more cooperation with India in the technology sector, in the trade sector, in the energy sector, especially because of the strides India has made in technology in many ways. And therefore, I think this is a good conversation to have in terms of how then it hurts. It hurts investment, it hurts reputation, and most importantly, it causes serious harms to people's lives. So I do think that there can be a conversation about the inconsistency of, on one hand, sort of leading in digital technology and then constantly using the kill switch to cut off internet access. Thank you.
Okay, we are down to the last 6 minutes. What are some ways of enforcing the checks and balances that the Supreme Court recommends, and given the government's tendency to ignore any such ruling or bypass them entirely, how can the IFF or an individual affect the shutdown or its implementation? So, enforcement of checks and balances that have already been recommended.
You should talk about how an individual can actually make a change. You should talk about the Ashlesh Biradar versus the state of West Bengal judgment that I've been part of.
So rapid reaction and filing writ petitions in court sometimes do lead to results, like in Ashlesh's case and in West Bengal, you were able to restore the internet. I think large levels and strategies at IFF are are towards institutional engagement, towards strategic litigation, those kind of things. But I'd like to go back to what Vineet said quite often, and I picked this up from the MKSS story, which is a book about how the RTI Act and the transparency movement built into a movement by itself. So you have a Supreme Court judgment, but we know the black letter of the law does not enforce itself. Quite often in weak rule of law societies like India, where institutional culture quite often also happens to be compromised by a strong political executive, right? So quite often what is needed are for people, for individuals, not only organizations like IFF, to articulate this much more often to the public officials, to articulate it to people at the district level, at the panchayat level by itself, to put it in petitions, to put it as a part of electoral demands, to make it a part of civic and social consciousness. And when that starts happening, right, it is that time, I think so, institutional processes, given that we are a weak rule of law society, wake up and support that kind of citizen movement. So I think much more work needs to be done around it. And I hope that much more work does not need to be done around it. And maybe our institutions itself, maybe I'm wrong, end up issuing directions for implementation of the Anuradha Bhasin judgment. As a sidebar, the Shreya Singhal judgment, which struck down Section 66A, was given in 2015. It took us about 7 to 8 years to get all the cases closed. Fresh cases were still registered under that provision, which criminalized online speech and was ruled unconstitutional. And this is speaking to the deficiency of the criminal justice system in India, but is also a wider comment on how court judgments do not enforce themselves. Sometimes you have to go back to court, but what's always better is for a mix of non-legal, social, mobilization, organization, as well as institutional strategies.
Has the Indian government ever shut down the internet in cities like Bombay and Bangalore? Or would they hesitate because of the financial loss?
I'll take it. Thanks, Rohini. I mean, in fact, the only one, and Apar, you correct me if I'm wrong, the only one that I remember of like a big city being affected by internet shutdowns was Delhi, and during protests. And even then, it was only, in fact, in a limited area, which is when we realized that the government does have the capacity to actually really limit the territory and scope of internet shutdown when it was in Delhi. So I think what the questioner is getting at here is actually quite valuable, which is that you don't see internet shutdowns that much in the big cities. It is very rare, if at all. And that is also the reason why you probably don't see the level of protest against internet shutdowns that you would have imagined in a country that is so digitized. Because, you know, like Vineet started with, a lot of these shutdowns are in places where the voices are very rarely heard. These are not voices you will often hear on social media, which makes the loudest noise. You know, people in Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore who are on social media and make the noise actually have very little disruption to their internet. In fact, I think the value of a report like this is precisely this. You know, I remember, and this is like a personal anecdote, when I was talking to my family and was telling them that, you know, I am looking at internet shutdowns, and I'm very interested in thinking about what happens in rural communities, because there is so much digitization. And the first response from my family was, why would you look at internet connections in rural communities? They probably don't have that much access. So they probably are not affected as much if it is shut down. So you understand the disconnect between urban India and rural India here? And that is precisely why you don't see the protest, you don't see the uproar, you don't see the pushback against internet shutdowns, because people whose voices are heard in the media, on social media, around us, are not people affected by it oftentimes. And their lives are also, you have to understand the disproportionate harm that we talk about. Like Vineet said, 96% of Indian subscribers use mobile internet. And if you think about even those with fixed line internet, over 90% of fixed line internet are in urban areas, which means it is rural communities who are not connected to the internet with fixed line. And people in urban areas, those who can afford fixed line internet, are often not affected by shutdowns, also because shutdowns largely, most often, are on mobile internet. So the disproportionate harm is always to communities who are the least heard, and that is why the least pushback.
There are more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time completely, so we will have to close it here. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you also to all panelists today.
Thank you so